As we continue in 2 Kings chapter 5, it absolutely glows with biblical principles that we also find in the New Testament, especially those associated with the life and works of Yeshua HaMashiach. Now, the main figure in this narrative is a Gentile army commander named Naaman. Now, Naaman works for Ben-Hadad, who's the king of Aram, which in modern terms is Syria. And as a side note, we've encountered the name Ben-Hadad in earlier chapters, and we're going to encounter that name again. It's not the same person each time. Ben-Hadad means something like son of the sun god. It was a title that Aramean kings commonly held as opposed to a king's formal name. Now, Naaman was a relatively good and decent man who was held in high esteem by the Syrian king, apparently by his household, because we're told that this young Hebrew girl, who was a house slave of Naaman's household, told his wife that she wished Naaman could go have his sarat cured by the prophet in Shomron. She was speaking of Elisha, who lived in Samaria. Now, sarat is usually translated in our English Bibles as leprosy, and that is a poor translation. Indeed, sarat is a skin disease. However, it's not any specifically medically defined skin disease. Certainly, it's not leprosy. But the point that is missed by most Bible commentators and teachers is that the type and extent of the skin disease, that's not the issue. What matters is the cause of it. Sarat is caused by God. It is God that's inflicting a highly visible, often disfiguring disease upon somebody as an outward sign of a sinful or unclean inner spiritual condition that would otherwise be hidden, except to the Lord, because he sees us for who we really are. The Israelites fully understood that. However, what is interesting is that since Jehovah is the God of the Hebrews, why would this Gentile army commander, who by definition worships different gods, have it? Now, theoretically, all Gentiles had an unclean and sinful inner spiritual condition, since they did not worship the God of Israel. And thus, sarat should only affect Hebrews who had been unfaithful to their God, Jehovah. In fact, the various Jewish writers of the Talmud generally conclude that even though the word sarat is specifically used in the scriptures to describe Naaman's skin disease, that it had to be something else, because in their minds, sarat only affects Jews. I disagree with their conclusion. This question is not answered for us specifically, however. Perhaps the result of the story, maybe. It gives us a hint as to why this occurred to Naaman the Gentile. The Lord had prepared his heart to accept him. In any case, this skin disease was no doubt embarrassing, it was uncomfortable, and Naaman was trying most anything so he could have it cured. And surely he had exhausted every avenue that the prophets and the priests of his own gods had suggested, and the Aramean physicians had prescribed to him, but all of it to no avail. So upon hearing of yet another possibility, no matter how remote it seemed, he went to his king, Naaman did, and he was more than happy to let Naaman go to Israel to seek a cure, and even have him sent with an entourage and a vast sum of monetary gifts to the very king he had been battling against, King Jehoram of Israel. And along with the gifts was a letter of introduction and instruction, expecting for Jehoram, King Jehoram, to heal Naaman. So let's pick up our story by rereading part of chapter 5 in the book of 2 Kings. 2 Kings, chapter 5. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, we'll be starting on page 405. Page 405, 2 Kings, chapter 5. We're going to read verses 7 through 14. When the king of Israel finished reading the letter, he tore his clothes. Am I God, able to kill and make alive, he asked, so that he sends me a man to heal of Sarat? You can see that he's only seeking an excuse to quarrel with me. But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent a message to the king. Why did you tear your clothes? Just have him come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with horses and chariots, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him who said, Go, bathe in the Jordan 7 times. Your skin will become as it was, and you will be clean. But Naaman became angry, and he left, saying, Now, I thought for certain that he would come out personally, that he'd stand and call the name of Adonai his God and wave his hand over the diseased place, and so the person with and heal the person with Sarat. Aren't Amanah and Parpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the water in Israel? Why can't I bathe in them and be clean? So he turned and he went off in a rage. But his servants approached him and said, My father, if the prophet had asked you to do something really difficult, wouldn't you have done it? So doesn't it make even more sense to do what he says when it's only bathe and be clean? So he went down and immersed himself 7 times in the Jordan, as the man of God had said to do, and his skin was restored. And it became like the skin of a child, and he became clean. I think that King Jehoram, or in English, Jehoram, a weak, self-centered, thoroughly corrupt man, somewhat misinterpreted the letter he received from the king of Syria. The letter seemed to plainly say that Ben-Hadad fully expected Jehoram to personally cure Naaman. Yet if one reasonably assumes that the little Hebrew slave girl's suggestion that the prophet of Samaria, not the king, could cure Naaman was what Ben-Hadad had acted upon, then Ben-Hadad meant by his letter that King Jehoram should take the proper steps to see to it that his prophet Elisha would effect a cure for this valued Aramean military commander, Naaman. Now, from the Oriental viewpoint, prophets worked directly for kings, and the job of a prophet was to convince or even coerce the gods they worship into doing their bidding. So the king, he tells the prophet what he wants, and the prophet goes to the god he represents, and somehow or another gets that god to act accordingly. But Jehoram smells a rat. Verse 7 tells us that the king of Israel interprets Ben-Hadad's message as a setup for an excuse to start a war. That is, Jehoram complains that he's not God, so how can he possibly cure a disease that God caused? Therefore, he suspects that when Naaman is not cured, something that Ben-Hadad already knows Jehoram cannot do, this will provide Ben-Hadad with a phony excuse to attack, supposedly in retribution for being dishonored, especially after he sent this bountiful gift to King Jehoram. And in a shame and honor-based society that represented the entirety of the Middle East, such an excuse for war would have been fully understood, would have been accepted by all parties involved, but that was never Ben-Hadad's intent. But there was another problem. No doubt King Jehoram knew that only a prophet of God could have any hope of curing Naaman's tzara'at and thus staving off war with Aram. But the king of Israel had no relationship with the prophet Elisha. He detested Elisha. He'd kill him in a heartbeat if he thought he could get away with it. So the feeling was mutual. The prophet Elisha had no regard or respect for Jehoram, and no doubt saw him as an adversary to be aware of. Now somehow, word got to Elisha that the king of Israel was so depressed and anxiety-ridden that he had virtually entered a state of mourning because of this letter from Ben-Hadad. Remember, the king had torn his garments, which can be taken literally or merely as an idiom that means he was grief-stricken. And when Elisha responded by asking why the king would behave in this way, because what Jehoram displayed was a cowardly despair before any actual problem had ever arisen. The king was reacting upon a fear of what could happen, not upon any real or imminent danger. And that reality makes me wonder how many good and God-directed works have we as believers turned aside from even attempting it? Not because it was impossible, because we were afraid to try. Fears of failure, fears of humiliation, fears of facing something new, a change, the unknown, fears of being personally harmed. Fear is a powerful force in the psyche of a human being. And the Lord knows it, which is why in the Bible, often we hear God's admonition to his people to fear not. So when Elisha sent a message to King Jehoram, why did you tear your clothes? It's a rhetorical question that's actually chastising him for his lack of faith and courage. And the message from Elisha is basically saying that if you would just accept that Jehovah has a prophet in Israel who can handle this problem and cure this man of his tzara'at, you wouldn't be so full of grief. The truth is that God always gave his kings of Israel and Judah prophets so that his oracle could guide them in their rulings, in their decisions, and in this way the people of Israel and Judah could be blessed. Every king had a prophet of Jehovah available, but the kings of the northern kingdom usually didn't want them. Why? Because although they wanted prophets who represented those other gods. That's because these false prophets were malleable. They were quite willing to tell that king whatever he wanted to hear. But God's prophets were there to tell the king what God said, whether it sounded good or bad to the king. So here again we have another blaring God principle erupt. As worshipers of Jehovah and followers of Christ, we have a helper and a deliverer available to us anytime, anywhere, who's far greater than Elisha or even Elijah. And yet, because our evil inclination remains alive, still operating within us, because of our inherent humanness that did not flee from us when we were saved, much like King Jehoram, more often than not, our instinct is to not consult God, but instead act on our own when decisions and challenges confront us. Instead of instantly entering into earnest prayer, we will often merely descend into fear and anxiety. We act rashly, then we regret it. We become paralyzed when some kind of action has to be taken, but we're just too fearful to move. Or we assume that the outcome's already determined. No amount of prayer or action is going to have any effect, so why bother? That is what King Jehoram did. And it's why we find the prophet Elisha riding to the rescue. But Elisha was not coming to rescue Jehoram, but rather he was coming to rescue the situation. The entire purpose for healing Naaman would be not for Jehoram's sake, but for God's glory, so that all who witness it are going to bow down to the power of the God of Israel. We're not told by what means Naaman was instructed to go to Elisha's home instead of seeking out the king. But when he arrived, it was not with humility, but rather with all the pomp and circumstance that was customary for a man of Naaman's station. And in a pattern similar to how Elisha had dealt with the aristocratic woman of Shunem, Elisha does not speak directly to his visitor. He speaks through his servant messenger to this very important man, Naaman. And the message is, Naaman's to go down to the Jordan River. He's to immerse himself 7 times. And when he exits the river, he'll be cleansed. In Hebrew, taher. Please notice, he does not say, Naaman, you'll be healed. Indeed, taher means you will become ritually cleansed, not cured. The Jordan waters had no healing effect on his skin. That is, since Naaman's problem is that God sees him as spiritually unclean, and that uncleanness has caused God to give him an outward skin disease as a result, then as a natural result of Naaman becoming spiritually clean on the inside, then the skin disease on the outside goes away. Now, Naaman is completely taken aback by this entire scene. Not only is the prophet not even speaking to him directly, it seems absurd. Absurd. He's going to take a bath in a river, and that solves his problem? So he wants to know why Israel's river is any better than the beautiful rivers up in Syria, his home. The Amanah and the Pharpar rivers. Besides, he bathes in river water regularly. It's never had any effect before. Now, to Naaman's way of thinking, this prophet needs to appear before him and speak some kind of mysterious incantation that involved the name of Elisha's God, or wave his hand over the infected area, or something. Then it would be healed. At least that's the customary way it was done by the magicians and healers that he had known. So he became furious at having wasted his time only to be insulted and told a bunch of nonsense about bathing in a river. So he left. But his attendants proved to be a lot more wise and discerning than their master. They approached him in an affectionate or respectful manner, calling him Father, and then said words that ought to resonate with every believer in Yeshua. They asked him a profound question. had the prophet asked him to do something much more complicated and difficult than just bathing in the Jordan 7 times, wouldn't he have done it if it meant that he might finally be rid of this terrible, horrible skin condition? Wouldn't he have done it? Had the prophet told him to climb a dangerous mountain, to fight a couple of lions, go fast for a month, something that required a lot of his personal effort, his courage, something on Naaman's part, wouldn't he probably have undertaken it with zest? Naaman was a brave man of action. He was a military general. He had great discipline. Doing something to earn his healing, he would have undertaken no matter how difficult. He reconsidered it. He did as Elisha told him, and miraculously he was cleansed of his sarat. We're told his flesh became virtually new, just like the skin of a young boy. The scars of battle and age, the leathery wrinkles from frying out in that hot sun, and the hideous outward disfiguration from his inward unclean spiritual condition were all reversed, as though he had been reborn. But he had to pass through the living waters of Israel for that to happen. I hope the intended image is starting to grow in your minds. Here is as vivid a picture of the gospel in the Old Testament than we are ever going to find. God, through his prophet Elisha, told Naaman what he had to do to be cleansed of his unclean spiritual condition. But it was so easy and simple that it became Naaman's stumbling block. God offered this to Naaman with no merit, no work needed on Naaman's part other than enough faith to just trust in it. But Naaman's natural instinct was that he had to earn his deliverance from his uncleanness. Or that some powerful religious holy man had to perform some special costly ritual over him, and then he'd be released from his condition. Or that he could see no reason that deliverance couldn't happen by being immersed in the living water from some other source than Israel, some gentile source. Now, to make it as plain as possible, to those who might not be making the connection I'm trying to make, the way to our souls being made clean and acceptable to God is by merely being washed in the living waters of Israel. And those living waters are Christ, Yeshua. But that's a stumbling block for so many who cannot accept that faith and faith alone in the Messiah is the answer. Surely our behavior, our punctilious following of rules, our good deeds, giving lots to charity, hard work, all of this and more must be needed for us to have this grand, complete deliverance. But in fact, none of those things do anything but demean the free gift of salvation that God offers us through Christ. When we, in faith, accept God's way to deliverance, we are divinely cleansed. But it has to be faith in God's Messiah, not in another one of our choice. It must be the living waters of our Israelite Savior that we are immersed into under the Israelite covenants. And when we submit to this, we exit those living waters as though we were newborns, exiting the water of our mother's womb. We are reborn. We are new again. We don't need a prophet to do it for us, but merely to show us the way. No holy man has to be present. No ritual needs to be performed. It is personal, it is private between each individual and the Lord, and yet the requirement is the same for everyone. Rich or poor, slave or free, the requirement is this: complete surrender to the God of Israel without condition. That's the condition. It's interesting that in verse 13, Naaman's servant suggests that it's such a small thing to be told to bathe and be clean. So why not do it? What's holding you back? Bathe and be clean is the principle of the mikvah, which is Hebrew water immersion. No ritual is performed in that process, by the way. No one performs it upon you. You self-immerse. You go into the water alone and unclean and come up alone and cleansed. The water of the mikvah has no magical effect. Rather, all results are due to your trust and obedience to God's commandments. It's just an act of faith. Oh, there's witnesses, but they're not part of the immersion process. In fact, despite the many paintings and this mental image that we have of Jesus being baptized by John, I have no doubt that's not at all how it happened. John was there as a witness. He didn't dunk Yeshua. All Hebrew immersion is self-immersion. And Jesus and John didn't give us a whole new Christian ritual method of baptizing. And by the way, to baptize is but the English translation of the Greek word baptismo, which is a generic word that simply means to immerse something. To dunk it. It carries no meaning whatsoever of ritual or of method. The modern way the evangelical church has of assisting people in baptism by one or two people pronouncing words over the person as they literally dunk them under the water is totally unlike what happened with Christ in the Jordan. And it's not wrong. It's just far from the biblical procedure and pattern. Well, let's read a little bit more of 2 Kings chapter 5. We're going to pick up at verse 15 and go on to the end. So then with his whole retinue, he returned to the man of God, and he went and he stood before him, and he said, "Well, I've learned that there is no God on all the earth except in Israel. Therefore, please accept a present from your servant." But Elisha answered, "As Adonai lives, before whom I stand, I will not accept it." And despite his urging him to take it, he refused. So Naaman said, "Well, if you won't take it, then please let your servant be given as much earth as 2 mules can carry, because from now on your servant will will offer neither burnt offerings nor sacrifices to other gods, but only to Adonai. Accept this, and may God forgive your servant for it. When my master goes into the temple of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, when I bow down, may Adonai forgive your servant for this." And Elisha said to him, "Go in peace." Now Naaman had gone only a short distance from him, when Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said to himself, "Here, my master has made it easy on this Arami Naaman by not accepting from him what he brought. As Adonai lives, I'll run after him and get at least something from him." So Gehazi hurried off after Naaman. And when Naaman saw someone running after him, he got down from his chariot to meet him and asked, "Is everything all right?" "Yes," he replied, "my master sent me with this message. 2 young men have just now come to me, guild prophets from the hills of Ephraim. Would you be kind enough to give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothes?" "By all means, take 2 talents, said Naaman, pressing him. And he tied up the 2 talents of silver in 2 bags and gave them with the 2 changes of clothing to 2 of his servants who carried them ahead of Gehazi. On reaching the hill, he took the bags from them and put them away in the house. Then he let the men go, and they left. And he went in and stood before his master. And Elisha asked, "Where have you been, Gehazi?" "Your servant hasn't gone anywhere," he said. And Elisha said to him, "Wasn't my heart there with you when the man left his chariot to meet you? Is this a time to receive silver and clothing, and olive groves and vineyards and sheep and oxen and male and female slaves? Therefore, Naaman's Surat will cling to you and to your descendants forever." He left Elisha's presence with Surat as white as snow. That is scary. So we get this surprising expression of faith from Naaman as he says, "Well, I've learned that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel." Wow! Here is a Gentile man, a loyal and dedicated soldier of the highest rank, who can only respond to what has happened to him by admitting there is no God in all the earth except Jehovah. His inner spirit has been totally transformed. And he knows that this God dwells among Israel. Again, the significance of his statement is like having Yeshua speak directly to us. First, this is an absolute statement of monotheism. In a world of hundreds and hundreds of gods, Naaman realizes they don't exist, at least not for him. And second, there's only one God, the God of Israel. Even more, he asked for permission to literally transport some soil from Israel back to Syria with him so he can build an altar upon it and sacrifice to this God, Jehovah. I mean, it's really hard to find sufficient words to say just how much I wish the Gentile church could adopt this attitude. That I believe, frankly, is not so much a choice but as a duty. I mean, far from building a wall of separation between his Gentileness and the Hebrew people, he attached himself as a Gentile even to the land of Israel. But he fully understands that this God is Israel's God. And he calls Israel, this God does, his earthly dwelling place. So does Naaman renounce his nation and his Gentileness and become a Hebrew? No. At least not physically. But he does spiritually. He pronounces he will no longer burn incense to other gods. In other words, he's not going to worship the gods of Aram, his nation, anymore. But in verse 18, he asks Elisha for forgiveness because, unfortunately, part of his duties as Aram's military commander is to go to religious services with the king of Aram at the temple of the god Ramon and bow down at the temple. Ramon is the god of thunder and lightning and flood in Aram. It's not something he wants to do, but he feels he has little choice in the matter. And Elisha responds to him simply saying, Shalom. That's what peace be with you. That's what it's really saying here. Shalom. This is not permission. It's not tolerance. It is simply leaving the matter open-ended. Frankly, I see it as wisdom. Because when one first comes to faith, you can't climb that mountain of maturity in one day. We find it that in the book of Acts, that Jesus' brother, James the Just, takes that same approach. during Paul's visit to him as concerns what to do about all these Gentiles who have recently turned to Israel's God and Messiah, but from a practical matter, they still live out in that heathen society. In Acts 21:25. However, in regard to the Gentiles who have come to trust in Yeshua, we all joined in writing them a letter with our decision that they should abstain from what had been sacrificed to idols, from blood, from what is strangled, and from fornication. Now, in no way were these Gentiles of faith relieved from being obedient to God's commandments, but just as with young children who first come to faith, you take baby steps to bring them along, because you realize that their understanding and thus their practices are primitive and they're immature and they're very limited at this point. Well, backing up a couple of verses, we find Naaman offered to pay Elisha for what he had done to achieve this man's deliverance. But Elisha makes it clear he can't accept any money. He didn't sanctify Naaman in order to earn money. He only did it to glorify God. To have accepted anything for this would be to fraudulently accept a gratuity and some credit for something the Lord did. So here, beginning in verse 20, we have an irony. We've just read about the simple faithfulness of a Gentile towards God, a Gentile who had essentially adopted the spirit and soul of a Hebrew, but now we have a Hebrew, the great prophet Elisha's own personal assistant named Gehazi, who has obviously adopted the spirit and the soul of a Gentile heathen. Gehazi can't stand it that this Gentile would come to Israel, he'd accept Israel's God, offer a fortune, and it was a fortune that he was willing to give to Elisha, and Elisha refuses it. No doubt on one hand, Gehazi could imagine all the good it could do for the prophet guild communities that lived in near poverty. But on the other hand, he saw an opportunity for personal gain. So Naaman is homeward bound, and Gehazi chases after him. And Naaman recognizes him and wonders if something's happened. And Gehazi proceeds to fabricate a story about some prophets who came to him for clothing and money, and so he asked for 2 changes of clothing and what would have amounted to 66 pounds of silver. The grateful Naaman offered Gehazi essentially double what he asked for. And what echoes this narrative brings us by of these instructions given by our Messiah on his Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew 5:40-42, he says this: if someone wants to sue you for your shirt, let him have your coat as well. If a soldier wants you to carry his pack for a mile, carry it for 2. When someone asks you to do something, asks you for something, give it to him. When something wants to borrow something from you, lend it to him. But the streetwise Naaman decides he's going to send 2 of his men to accompany Gehazi back to Samaria. No doubt this had a dual intention. First was that Gehazi was going to be transporting 130 pounds of silver, a fortune, with him, and would be subjected to bandits. Second, the rabbis say that Naaman was suspicious. He didn't necessarily trust Gehazi. I mean, after all, Elisha had made it abundantly clear that he would not accept anything from Naaman. In fact, the wording of the passage makes it clear that this esteemed man of God, who had just proven himself to be exactly that, had made a vow in Jehovah's name not to accept a thing. And now suddenly here comes this servant of Elisha's, all by himself, claiming that this same Elisha had sent him to get some money from Naaman. A little suspicious here. It's a little lesson for us. Just because someone says they represent God, or actually is a believer, or even has a vocation that is in service to God, doesn't automatically make them trustworthy or even incapable of doing something sinful or harmful to another person. It's not good stewardship, folks, to be naive and just blindly give your money, all right, to a church or a synagogue or even a Christian acquaintance merely because of their position or their story, especially if you have a check in your spirit about it. You have to be wise. Be wise. Do a little investigating. But when Gehazi returns, he's confronted by Elisha, and of course, Gehazi continues his deception. Elisha asks him where he's been. Gehazi answers, I haven't been anywhere. Elisha knew everything, but he wanted to give Gehazi an opportunity to come clean and repent. But the lure of so much money to be gained so easily, an opportunity probably never occur again in his lifetime. It was just too tempting. And so the foolish servant just kept lying. You know, it's amazing how when we determine to deceive others, we can so easily deceive ourselves. I mean, did Gehazi not understand who he was dealing with on earth and in heaven? His master was one of the two greatest prophets ever to live. Gehazi had personally witnessed many of Elisha's miracles. Elisha had been given the gift to see things, to have visions whenever God decided to give it to him, and of this his servant was acutely aware. And even if Elisha hadn't seen, the Lord had. Did Gehazi think he would escape the watchful gaze of God Almighty? I mean, it's amazing what some temptations will do to us as human beings. How many pastors have sadly succumbed to theft, to pornography? Perhaps their congregations and their families had been fooled. But did they think Christ didn't know? How many laypersons who show up at their church or synagogue without fail and yet cheat on their spouses or are unfair in their business practices? They seem to think that because their pastor or their fellow church members aren't aware of it, that their sin's just going to go unnoticed by the Lord. Maybe they'll just receive a kindly wink and nod from him. You know, it's utterly irrational that Gehazi would think he could get away with such a heinous crime. But Elisha makes it clear. He knows all about it. So Gehazi's punishment is directly proportional to his sin. And, of course, to the context of the situation. Following the Torah principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, he will now wear the outer mark of his inner spiritual condition that Naaman has just been relieved from. Gehazi will be given sarat. And as often happens when one commits such a serious crime against God, it has long-lasting, unintended consequences on those we love, we care about the most. So not just Gehazi, but his descendants are going to bear this uncleanness indefinitely. Next week, 2 Kings chapter 6.